Hi, this is Uncle Matt's D&D Studio. I'm Matt Finch. What we're talking about right here is the basic definition of the OSR, which is a term that you may have run into here and there on the internet when people are talking about Dungeons & Dragons. If you'll go ahead and subscribe to the channel, please, there are going to be more videos coming up. That'll give you some notification about what they're going to be. And let's move on to the topic while you're subscribing and talk about what is the OSR. What do people mean when they're talking about that? It's a term that's been around since about 2007, 2008 on various old school bulletin boards, forums, blogs, and so on. And what it means is old school Renaissance. A few people talk about it as being old school rules, but I'm going to work with old school Renaissance because that's the more common use of the term, and I think it's a little more specific, as you'll see. What that is talking about, first of all, it's mainly about Dungeons & Dragons. There are other games that are often called OSR, but for the most part, what people are talking about is Dungeons & Dragons here. The term refers to a massive upsurge in two things that again happened in about 2007, 2008. Those two things were, first of all, a huge uptick in the amount of talking and communication that was going back and forth between people who played early editions of Dungeons & Dragons, and that happened first on forums, and then it really expanded once people started talking on blogs at the point that the internet presented blogs as being a possibility. And you saw lots and lots of those, and then an additional increase when Google Plus came into play as a platform. So all of that communication had to do, for the most part, with advances in internet technology, and it was becoming easier and easier for people who played the early editions, the early out-of-print editions of D&D, to find each other, ways to talk to each other, different modes of communication that happened to be more fun or more pleasant for the various people who were doing the talking, or for ways to listen. So that's one of them. And then the other aspect of the OSR was a corresponding increase in publication of different resources. And by publication, I don't mean books that were going out to game stores or that were hitting the mainstream of gaming. This, especially at the beginning, was kind of an underground movement. Most of it was cottage industry at the best, and at the simplest level, it was simply people who were coming out with something that was entirely do-it-yourself and was often addressed to the do-it-yourself gamers out there. So it would be things like, here are some ideas. Here is a character sheet that you can use for first edition advanced D&D. Here are some adventure hooks, and then in some cases, here's the whole adventure that you can use for one of these out-of-print rule sets, which tend to be very, very compatible with each other. And so there was a broad use of different rule systems in these things for something like an adventure. And that again was probably part of the reason that there were enough people out there to begin reaching this critical mass, because even if you played original D&D or first edition advanced D&D or one of the basic sets, all of that was compatible, and therefore there was a large enough group of people to make it worthwhile to publishers, including just amateurs who were, hobbyists giving out information, to make it rewarding because there was a large enough audience for that kind of thing. The publishing side most likely got started with the idea of a retro clone, which came out in about 2006. The first one was written by myself and Stuart Marshall, and it was called Osric, and it was a version of first edition advanced D&D, but the key thing about it was that it was written under the open game license. It was released as open game content, and the result of that was that there was a safe harbor for people who wanted to publish resources using that material. Up until that point, there had been a great deal of fear and concern that if you published something like that on any sort of a large scale, that Wizards of the Coast might come after you legally and say that you were violating copyright law. And by moving together a couple of legal concepts, we were able to create a safe harbor from that. And one of the results was that over time there were several other retro clones for specific out-of-print systems, probably most notably Labyrinth Lord, which was for the Moldvay basic set, and then Swords and Wizards, which was written by Dan Proctor of Goblinoid Games, and then probably the next one after that was Swords and Wizardry, which was one that I wrote for original D&D, 1974 to 1978. And those three, I think, are the core, but there are many, many more of them. The publication, in addition to that legal safe harbor, another thing that happened right about that time was the beginning of print on demand, and it was through a company called Lulu.com, which is still out there, and it's still a place that there are lots of old school resources available. Up until that point, you could really only make a PDF of something, or you could go to a printer and print things out, but that was very expensive and risky, because if you wanted to do it cost effectively, you had to order lots and lots of copies. When Lulu came in with the print on demand, what you were able to do was put your PDF into their files, and then when someone ordered it, that person ordering it could actually get a physical copy of the thing that you had written. And up until that point, that wasn't a possibility, or at least it was not a possibility without considerable financial risk to you. So those two things together, the legal safe harbor that Stuart and I created for OSRIC, plus the availability of print-on-demand technology, came together with that increasing surge of people who were coming together on the internet as a result of internet technological advances, and it all crammed together and then started to really snowball. The size of people who identify themselves as being part of the old school Renaissance has absolutely increased geometrically from that point in time. In fact, in 2006, 2007, and I guess 2008, there was a joke that there were only 137 of us. That was started by Jim Radji, who's the publisher of Lamentations of the Flame Princess, and the joke was that the 137 of us were just publishing for the 137 of us. So it was a big watermark the first time that somebody had sales in excess of 137. So when you see people out on the internet talking about the old school Renaissance, or OSR, they may be talking about any one facet of that, publishing, community, or they may be talking about a style of gaming, or they may just generally be talking about the whole thing. When people are talking about it, they usually mean one of roughly three things. Either specifically people who are playing the out-of-print versions of these games, or possibly one of the clones, but really you definitely have the group of people who are saying, why even bother with a clone or an additional version of the game? You know, I play first edition D&D, and those books are out there, so I'm just going to buy the books on eBay and play that game specifically. Other people like using retro clones for their game, partly because the PDFs are usually free and you can distribute those out to players just to take a test drive of the system. And also, the vast majority of the publication of resources, even for first edition advanced D&D, is usually being done under a retro clone. Once again, because that provided a safe harbor for the publishers. People, when they're referring to the OSR, may also be talking about the products or discussion about playing in the style of the early D&D games, not necessarily with exactly the same rule systems. And so this would include a few things like open-ended rules that foster the use of player skill in the course of the adventure. And obviously there's a spectrum there, but there are certain ways in which system matters for presenting the players with the sort of meaningful choices and intellectual challenges free of the use of rules to bypass some of those challenges. Then another facet of that might be the fact that the characters are generally fairly non-heroic or less heroic. They're neither superheroes nor are they necessarily engaged in a mission to save the world. The mission might be something like, I'm going to steal those rubies that I saw that merchant have. Or it might be something like, hey, here's this tiny little village off in the middle of nowhere, but I'm going to go ahead and help them out, even though it's less heroic than throwing a ring into Mount Doom and therefore, destroying Sauron and saving the world. It's a much smaller type of scale on things. Other facets that would be involved, generally people talk about old school gaming as involving a sandbox environment with less railroading toward where you need to go. Obviously, that's something that can show up in later editions as well, but as a style of gaming, that's often lumped in there with the old school. Again, there is a system matters issue there simply because the old school rules are generally simpler, which allows you to create more stuff, which means that you're freer to just let the players go wherever the hell they want to. Whereas in most of the later systems, there's a little bit more dungeon master prep time that's involved, and so kind of as a matter of courtesy, the players are like, okay, look, we'll follow along the lines because we know if we go too far off track, all of a sudden, we're making you have to fly by the seat of your pants using a system that really requires a little bit more preparation time for it. So there's the sandbox versus the railroad spectrum. And then there are some things that I think are less key, but that a lot of people still mean when they're talking about OSR. And so, for example, the style of the art. The older games were done for printing reasons in black and white. And at the time, that even in the oldest ones, that even meant staying away from grayscaling. So you get black and white line art being seen as more old school. You have the common conception, I think it's a misconception, that old school games are more lethal. Again, system matters. It didn't take long to create a character, and therefore if your character died, it wasn't too much effort to go ahead and roll up a new character. Whereas in a more complex game where there's more to character creation, it's a bigger tragedy and possibly a matter of slowing down the game if you have a high level of lethality involved. I think it's a misconception that is a feature of old school gaming, but it's certainly something that old school gaming permits more readily if it's the sort of game that you want to play. And given the fact that a lot of it is less heroic, those interact. Your character is probably a smaller feature in the world, and being a smaller feature and more human scaled in the world, it makes sense that person could conceivably die fairly easily going into the kind of places that adventurers go into. And then last, I'll mention something again. This, I think, is not a definitive factor of old school, but it is something that a lot of people identify as being part of old school and therefore part of the old school Renaissance. And that is less focus on the idea of being in character. People see old school as being a game of skill on the part of the player. And so that, if you're playing your stupid barbarian and you're trying to hold back from making intelligent suggestions about the game or what to do, most old school players would say, hey, it is a game and you're a player. If you come up with a great idea, it really doesn't matter whether your barbarian is stupid. And then also in terms of being in character, there's an old school game very seldom will suggest to you that give it your best shot at having that dwarf talk in a Scottish accent, or having an elf playing the role of an elf. Those are usually downscaled in the OSR games, and certainly there can be, and again, system matters, there can be old school games that are almost entirely beer and pretzels, and that they can be played that way. So that's my summary of what the OSR is all about when people talk about it. Obviously, the person who's talking about it may not necessarily have this whole definition of it in mind, but it certainly gives you an idea of what the old school players are generally talking about when they talk about something that is an OSR game, and just again, not necessarily D&D. There are several games that are considered old school that aren't necessarily D&D, like Traveler. Anything that was written back in the day is usually going to be considered old school, even though it may not carry the characteristics of old school Dungeons and Dragons. And so with that, I will leave it to you. Whatever version of D&D that it is that you play, imagine the hell out of it.